Today, we're going to talk about natural selection and how that acts on behavior and how that behavior is displayed in Trinidadian guppies. So let's get started with a little bit about natural selection. So natural selection is the evolutionary process occurring over many generations that leads to variation among phenotypes seen in nature. It's the idea of survival of the fittest. The organism that has the best traits most suited for survival will ultimately survive and reproduce to pass on these same traits to its offspring. The idea of natural selection also applies to behavioral traits. For example, if an organism has a gene that codes for a specific behavior that is more favorable for survival, then that organism will survive and live to pass on the genetics that code for that behavior to its offspring. This results in the offspring having a greater level of fitness. Nature acts as the selective agent, in this case, of natural selection. Therefore, a behavioral trait that helps ensure an individual's survival in its environment or that helps an individual reproduce better in its environment will be favored over less helpful variants of that trait. Over time, the frequency of the trait that is passed on to the offspring will increase in the population. A real-world example of natural selection acting on behavior can be observed in the behavioral differences that have developed between Trinidadian guppies that live in two separate parts of a stream. Now I'm going to show you two habitats that we find these guppies in. Here we have two Trinidadian guppy habitats. On the left side, we have an upstream low predation site in Trinidad, or low predation stream in this case, where there would be low predation pressure and fewer predators. On the right side, we have a downstream high predation site where there would be higher predator pressure and more predators present. So we have upstream guppies versus downstream guppies. A better illustration of this is shown in this figure. Here we have a low predation site where there will be fewer predators and less predation pressure. And then downstream of the waterfall, we have a high predation site with higher numbers of predators and higher predation pressure as well. So like I was saying, we've got Trinidadian guppies that live in two separate parts of a stream. Guppies that are found upstream from waterfalls typically experience weak predation pressure, meaning that they experience little danger from potential predators at this site. Guppies found downstream from waterfalls typically experience a greater or severe predation pressure, meaning that they experience high levels of danger from multiple predators at this site. Although the high and low predation sites are not located very far from one another, as you saw in the diagram, it could be just several kilometers apart, there is usually little to no gene flow or intermixing of genes between the guppies at each site, which basically means that the guppies aren't able to interbreed. The two groups are relatively separate. Therefore, since the types of predators found at each site, either upstream or downstream from a waterfall, vary, natural selection must have acted on the guppies at each site to favor different traits in upstream and downstream guppies. In Willing's 2010 study, Genome-wide scans of guppies that live in different sites found certain genetic signatures which indicate that natural selection has been favoring certain alleles that are linked to behavioral traits found in guppies at high and low predation sites. So each set of guppies at each site had their own specific set of behavioral traits. One example of the differences in behavioral traits seen in upstream versus downstream guppies that was acted on by natural selection is anti-predator behavior. And researchers have extensively studied anti-predation behavior in guppies and in other fish too. Anti-predator behaviors like shoaling, which is when fish swim together in a group, and predator inspection, which is the tendency of an individual fish to move towards a predator in order to assess danger. They've both been studied to evaluate the difference in anti-predator behavior between guppies at both up and downstream sites, or low and high predation sites. So researchers found that the guppies from high predation sites will shoal more tightly and in greater numbers than the guppies found at low predation sites. At low predation sites, remember, there's less pressure from predators than there are at high predation sites where we'll have more predators present. Additionally, researchers found that guppies from high predation site, where again, there is a greater threat from predators, will use more caution when inspecting a predator and will inspect more often than guppies in low predation sites, where there is less of a threat from predators. And this makes sense. If there are more predators around, it makes sense that a guppy would want to inspect more often and more cautiously. So, guppies from high predation sites inspect a potential threat more cautiously and more often, and will shoal in tighter, larger groups than low predation site guppies will. These findings suggest that the difference in anti-predator behavior is probably the result of the differing levels of natural selection pressures that guppies experience at high and low predation sites in either up or downstream sites from the waterfall. Since guppies who live downstream experience higher predation pressure, we see that natural selection must have favored some of these behaviors. We see differences in the behaviors between these two groups of guppies because of the different natural selection pressures present at each site. These behaviors allow these fish to survive in their respective environments, and therefore they can reproduce and pass on the alleles associated with such behaviors to their offspring. Eventually, an increase in the behavior can be observed in the entire population, and this takes place over time. And this idea has been supported by researchers' observations of behaviors in guppies living in areas of high versus low predation. Thank you for coming to my little essay TED Talk.